I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. This is the 6th episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame that will return to being monthly after a couple months off. And I could blame it all on astronomy and busy astronomers, but I tried really hard with 3 different astronomers to have them come on and talk about Nightfall, but instead we're just going to talk about their articles. But I also had some stuff going on, to be honest with everybody. And I've mentioned this in the podcast, but I was one of the main organizing hosts here in San Diego of StokerCon, which is the largest horror writers convention in the world, international gathering. We had 750 people. I was in charge of 103 pieces of programming in 3 days. I was a little stressed. I got to be honest with y'all. So that pushed back this series a little bit, but I'm going to be back on track, and we'll be back next time with The Weapons Shop by Avon Books next. And I'm recording that very soon. So I am back on track. I swear to you. And the other thing I had going on is I went to the Philip K. Dick Festival, the 4th, and we're getting that back on track as a biannual fest. So start saving your pennies, because in 2026, the Philip K. Dick Festival is coming back to Orange County, and we have incredible stuff planned. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be at Cal State Fullerton, where I'm wearing the shirt for. And it's going to be awesome. So, but that's 2 years out. But, you know, we're talking about astronomy, and when you do astronomy, you think 2 years out, because we have all this stuff planned and thought out. So my guests today are Alec Nevala-Lee and Seth Heasley. Let's start with Alec. In case people haven't seen, you've been on this podcast before. You two have been on this podcast before together, talking about Clifford Samac in our 30s series. But Alec, tell the folks who you are if somebody just happened to find this because they want to hear about Nightfall.
Number one, thanks for having me over. I'm excited to talk about this story. So in this particular context, I'm best known as the author of the book Astounding. John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction, which was a Hugo and Locus Award finalist, came out in 2018. It's a group biography of those 4 writers plus other people in their lives, other writers, other fans during the 1930s onward in science fiction in America. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about Isaac Asimov and this particular story. So yeah, that's the relevant information. I'm looking forward to talking more.
And I should note that I pulled that book off from the shelf on the front of my desk because it's part of my reference shelf that hangs out in front of my face all the time. So
that's a real compliment. I'm really glad to hear that.
It's right between the Futurians and the Informal History of the Hugos by Joe Walton. So
that's kind of where it belongs. That's a good spot for it.
Yeah, it's a good spot. Seth.
Hey.
Now, to give you a similar compliment, I just listened to your Tim Powers episode this morning. So I'm consuming your stuff too. Tell the folks who you are.
Well, that episode dropped today, so while we're recording this. And thanks for having me, David. It's been too long. We've been talking about how to get together. So cool to be back. Yeah, I'm the host of Hugos There, which is actually on the nomination list, the finalist list this year for the 2024 Hugos for Best Fan Cast, which is very fun. Although it's going to make it so Worldcon is a little more nerve-wracking for me. But both of you have been guests, and actually, Alec joined me to do an episode about Isaac Asimov, kind of a deep dive on where to start with him, where to go.
Great episode. Highly recommend.
Yeah, that was a good one. I can't remember if that was I don't remember what year that was, Alec. I think it's in the Hugo packet this year.
It must have been this year.
Yeah. 2023, I think, when we recorded it. So I think it's in the packet that I submitted because that was an excellent episode.
Yeah.
Nice.
And I was on your podcast to talk about The Dispossessed, I think
Mhm.
last time. I was on when we did
Way
Way
Station.
Station, didn't
Yeah.
we?
Yeah.
Clifford Smack. Yeah. And Seth's been here a bunch of times and
Yeah.
also on my other podcast, Dickheads, which Alec has also been on. So you can find these guys all over the place. I can't even keep straight how many times I've had these guys on because I call on them a lot. And
Actually, I don't think you've had me on Dickheads. I think I've only been on, we did the Star Trek one as well.
you are wrong. You were on Dickheads because we did the Scholar. I
Right,
had
right,
you
right,
on
right, right.
to help me co-host the Scholar panel.
Yeah.
So yes, you have been on Dickheads.
All right, fine.
All right. But
Meanwhile, I haven't had you on Take Me to Your Reader to cover Stir of Echoes like you've been asking for like 4 years.
yes, that's true. We should do that. And
Yeah.
I will say once again, I think that would be a great episode of Take Me to Your Reader, which is another podcast you do, which you should tell people about because that's a great podcast as well.
Yeah. That one's about adapted science fiction. So we look at books that have been turned into movies, and we've actually done an episode on Nightfall.
That's right. And that's a good episode. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted you on this episode is because I like that episode of Take Me to Your Reader. Now, for if anyone doesn't know me, this is my podcast. You should know me. But if you don't, I'm the author of The Last Night to Kill Nazis, which is available nationwide at Barnes and Nobles. And if you hate Nazis but like vampires, it's the book for you. But my most recent book is a science fiction weird novel called People's Park. And People's Park is recently come out from Quire Books, and it is my first novel that I wrote after starting the Dickheads podcast. So it's very Dickian, and but it's a coming of age sci-fi horror novel that's set in 1989. And that's all I got to say because I will have bonus material coming out from the book release party that we did during the solar eclipse in Indiana the day before the solar eclipse. We didn't do the book release during the solar eclipse. But I did, by the way, guys, do the solar eclipse from the Captain Janeway statue in Bloomington. And that was a great experience because
that is pretty cool.
Nice.
Mr. Eclipse of Iran was also there. And so I did my first interview on Iranian TV, which was interesting. But, it's a solar eclipse. You do weird things.
Eclipse talk is appropriate for this book. So
exactly. So we are here to talk about the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, of course, which is all based on the stories that were in this book that was voted upon by Nebula eligible science fiction professionals at the time. And there's pretty much no way this story wasn't going to make it. This is one of the all-time classics of science fiction. It's been adapted into a novel and several films and radio programs. And but if you want more deep dive into that, go to Seth's podcast, Take Me to Your Reader. We will talk a little bit about those, but we're mostly going to focus on the short story, the original 1941 story. And it was a quick turnaround too. But so let's get into the history of that. And that's where we call upon our Asimov expert. Alec, tell us the story of how this story happened, because it's really fascinating.
Oh, well, thanks. I agree. The story behind this story is one of my favorites. So I'll start with kind of the day it was pitched, and then maybe go backwards a little bit to kind of give you some context about why it happened when it did. So on March 17th, 1941, Isaac Asimov went to go see John Campbell, the editor of Astounding Science Fiction. So Asimov at the time was still in high school. Or actually, was he in college at that point? I think maybe actually he was in college.
So yeah, he was in college.
Yeah. So but a young guy, right? He had just broken into the magazine after a lot of unsuccessful attempts. And he lived in Brooklyn. All right. So a key thing about the Asimov story is that he happened to be living, a short train ride away from the Astounding office in Manhattan. And so it meant that he could go out and visit with Campbell, the editor, on, I would say, like a monthly basis. They would meet and talk, because Asimov was like a young, eager apprentice type, wanted to be in the magazine, was a big fan, but not really a professional writer. Whereas Campbell was, a hugely successful author in his own right, editor, and liked to have proteges, right? And he took on Asimov famously as almost an experiment to see if he could build a writer from the ground up. And so Asimov had sold a couple stories to Campbell at this point, for doing the first robot stories that were published in Astounding. And so, he'd published a few stories in the magazine, but was not seen as someone who was in the first rank of science fiction writers at that time. Those people would have been like Heinlein, Del Rey, DeCamp, Hubbard, Van Vogt.
Well, and I read that this was his 32nd story that he had written.
Yeah.
I don't know. That number seems high to me at that point. But
yeah, I mean, he certainly would have
published
written a lot of stories. He'd only published, I would say, 4 or 5, maybe, in Astounding at that point. He published an Amazing in some other places as well. But he famously said that the only stories of his that he thought counted were the ones he sold to Campbell. So and in Campbell's point of view, he was still kind of like a second tier writer. He was not someone Campbell named when asked to name his best authors. But this is about to change, okay, in ways that are, I think, very interesting. So Asimov comes to visit on March 17th, 1941, to meet with Campbell. And Campbell has an idea for a story, all right? And Campbell reads him a line from an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the line is, "If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown?" Then Campbell puts the book down and says, "What do you think would happen, Asimov, if men were to see the stars for the first time in 1,000 years?" And Asimov says, "I don't know." And Campbell says, "I think they would go mad. I want you to write a story about that." And so this is Campbell's idea. They hash out what I think, David, you're going to talk about later, why this could be possible. What are the scientific reasons why the stars might not be visible at other times? And then Campbell says, "Go home and write the story." So they agree to call it Nightfall. Asimov writes it very quickly. He delivers it. Campbell asks for some revisions, but it's already a really good story. And it kind of makes
April 9th, I believe he delivered it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he wrote it pretty fast. He says it came as easily as anything he'd ever written up to that point. He delivers it. It's the cover story. He gets a bonus for the first time, which Campbell only gives to stories he thinks of as being exceptionally good. And it's a huge hit with readers. It kind of cements Asimov as a first-rank writer for the first time. Okay, which is a big deal. Until then he was not especially well regarded. But the story, strikes a chord with readers for reasons that we'll probably talk about later. And as you mentioned, it is not only in the anthology, the Hall of Fame anthology, but it was the story that got the most votes. Right. So at the time when this anthology was published in the 70s, I believe, you could say that Nightfall was consensus, the greatest science fiction story of all time, at least according to the SIFWA, the voters for this particular poll. Maybe I'll pause there. I do want to talk a bit about the backstory, why Campbell may have wanted to pitch this story. But is there anything you guys wanted to add at this point?
Well, I do think when we get down to it, this might be like one of the hallmark, or this is definitely a foundational, no pun intended, science fiction story. And the fact that it got the most number of votes doesn't surprise me, because it is such a strong thing. I do think it's neat how quickly this story happened, that he first suggests the idea March 17th, he turns it in April 9th, he gets the word that that it's being bought on the 24th of April, and all these details that are known about the process. This mostly comes from Asimov's autobiography, right, where he kept all those detailed notes we've talked about before. But these things all coming together and happening so quickly, and so just like hitting so rock solid. Not every author has a story that just propels them like this in the way, but also just defines the genre and the science. Well, it doesn't super hold up to scrutiny from somebody like Sean Raymond, who I wish was here. It doesn't hold up to a ton of scrutiny, but for the time, the science is pretty amazing. And so my first thoughts on this story is it is neat that it starts with Campbell, and those are my first initial thoughts. Seth, do you have any initial thoughts before we get into the backstory more?
I mean, kind of talking about, and I'm curious to hear what you got from your astronomer contacts, because I think as somebody with a background in the sciences, and I know that Asimov also had a background in the sciences, how exactly they came up with the idea, the stellar mechanics of this, because to me, for someone like me, I need to read this story without thinking too hard about that part of it.
Right.
Because otherwise it burrs into my brain and I can't take the rest of it seriously. So I'm curious if there's anything in what you have to present to us about astronomy that's gonna move that out of my mind.
Yeah, we're gonna look at Sean Raymond made a map based on Asimov's concepts of it, the Asimov approved version, and then he came up with a what he thinks is a scientifically valid way of doing it. And for those who don't know, Sean Raymond has been on this podcast before. I had him on to talk just about world building, and one of the things he does is he creates computer models for solar systems. That's what he does. And so Sean just makes up orbital mechanics for solar systems, and he really kind of got the bug for this because of Nightfall, right? And so it was foundational for him. I got to stop saying that today. That
well,
is.
I'm going to say it at some point because it's relevant to what I am going to talk about.
Yeah, and so I do think we'll get more into that, but and man, and I know Alec's going to go into more detail on this whole relationship that Campbell had with the writers, but this is something that editors in this day and age had. Tony Boucher had a pipeline from his $1 Thursday night classes to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And that's why your Ron Goulart's, your Marion Zimmer Bradley's, your Philip K. Dick's, all got their first stories published with the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And it's no wonder that they were learning in that guy's living room, right? For $1 classes on Thursday nights. So Campbell and Boucher and all these, and Wollheim, Frederick Paul, they all had their friends that they threw ideas around with that became their stable. And Horace Gold, people came over and played cards with him, and smoke-filled rooms, and I'm sure a lot of the Galaxy stories came from that. And that is, and before we started recording, Alec and I were talking about the whole difference between, now a lot of the community is built online, and it's less, people sitting in a room throwing these ideas around, and something is lost, right? But Alec, I'm sure you want to go more into that relationship that Campbell had with his writers.
Yeah. So what's interesting to me about Campbell, among other things, is that he really was someone who imposed his interests and ideas on the magazine. So a lot of the stories that come out of this period, either his ideas or were written by writers who knew Campbell's interests, right? And they were tailored to him in particular. And so you see kind of his personality shaping the magazine in really obvious ways. Nightfall, there are two threads here that I want to talk about that I think are really interesting. So Campbell reads the Emerson quote to Asimov, and he says that I think if men saw the stars for the first time in 1,000 years, they would go mad. So the idea of men going mad, when exposed to some, horrible fact about the universe, this is kind of like a stock, spec fic trope, but it also reflects Campbell's interest in psychology. Okay, so one of the things you see in Campbell's work from the very beginning that pays off in weird ways much later on is the idea that psychology can be turned to an exact science. Okay, you see this in the 3 Laws of Robotics. You see this in stories about mental acceleration enhancement, that are common during this period. And later on, it kind of culminates in Dianetics, which is sort of Campbell's attempt to realize this in the real world with L. Ron Hubbard. And that's kind of a different story that we won't get into here. But it's really, there from the beginning. Campbell is always, interested in these things. And so when he says it to Asimov, I think men would go mad. To me, that reflects his interest in psychology, like in mass psychology, especially. What is the social impact, the psychological impact of this kind of event? All right. It's not an accident that he makes that central to this particular plot. The other thing that I think is really important to talk about is the idea of a theory of history, okay, which becomes important in Foundation, obviously, but also in a lot of other stories from this period. So one of my favorite pieces published in Astounding, which I don't think a lot of people have read, is an article by L. Sprague de Camp called The Science of Withering. It's a two-part article that came out, I believe, in July 1940 and August 1940. And it's a nonfiction article that surveys different theories of history, attempts to reduce history to a science. So these are people like, I think Marx comes up, but especially like Spengler and Toynbee are two historians who kind of come up with these models about the rise and fall of civilizations. And so when Asimov comes to pitch, or to talk to Campbell about this idea, that is foremost in Campbell's mind. He's thinking about this stuff a lot. A few months later, Jack Williamson is going to pitch some stories explicitly about the decline and breakdown of civilizations. And then most famously, like this summer of 1941, Asimov is going to pitch the Galactic Empire, the decline and fall of the Galactic Empire story, Foundation, which Campbell wants to turn into a series and wants to make it about psychohistory, which is not actually in Asimov's original pitch. Asimov just kind of wants to write a one-off story about the decline of the Galactic Empire. Campbell says it's going to be a series and it's going to be about psychohistory. And so that stuff comes from Campbell. All right. Asimov is not really interested in that idea as much as Campbell is. And you kind of see this later on, like Campbell, his influence is really obvious in the early Foundation stories. And then later, Asimov kind of downplays psychohistory because it's not really his thing. But Campbell is obsessed with this idea. And Nightfall, among other things, is about the cyclical, rise and fall of civilizations. The characters know, and maybe we'll summarize the plot later on, but they know that for some reason, every, what is it, 2,000 years?
2,000 years, yeah.
Okay. For some reason, civilization collapses, and no one knows why. And the astronomers in the story have a theory about why this happens on this cyclical basis. And they have a plan. They have a refuge that they have built to shelter themselves and their families, and also their research to prepare, to kind of rebuild or to, forestall, this cataclysm, from happening again. And this clearly is reminiscent of Foundation in a lot of ways. It ties into other stories from this period. But I think that we don't know what they talked about, Campbell and Asimov, during that first meeting, how much of that story was there. But it would shock me if that basic premise, the idea that, civilizations rise and fall in this, a predictable way that we can then try to like address if we know the cause, that to me is very Campbellian. That to me is something that Campbell was very interested in. And you can see why. Like the last thing I'll say is that, all these stories, 1940, 41, America is looking to Europe, right? There's a war in Europe. It has not reached American shores yet, but clearly they are worried. They don't know what's going to happen, right? And so this anxiety about what the future is going to bring in Europe in a few months is translated into a bunch of science fiction stories about the science of prediction, right? Of can we forecast the future precisely enough to affect it. And I think this is a great example of, how that story in the hands of a good writer can become like a really compelling plot.
Well, even talking about that cycles of history, right? You're talking about the time between America being involved in World War I and World War II, right? So you kind of have already a repeating cycle there that's in their consciousness.
Yeah, that's actually a great point. This is, like I was thinking about this the other day, like the build up to World War II was psychologically much worse than the build up to World War I because people had been through it before. They knew it was possible and they kind of saw it coming and they felt helpless to stop it.
Yeah. Kind of like this election, huh?
I wasn't going to say it, but no, I mean, there's a reason why. There's a reason why I think about these things a lot, right? I think these precious points. People are like, can we predict what's going to happen? We don't know, but I relate to that anxiety, and I understand how it feels to be living in history, before you know how it's going to turn out.
we'll break down the story in a little bit, but just to put a pin in this to remind me, the two things that really hit me this time reading Nightfall, and this is probably the 8th time I've read it or whatever, was the cycle. I hadn't really noticed how important that was. And the Campbellian connection definitely hit me, and that's probably because I read your book, Alec. And then I think the other thing is how much darkness and the fear of the dark is a kind of a monster in this story, and I hadn't really thought about that before. And I really started kind of world building in my head that in this society, they probably build their homes so they're constantly letting light in, right? And it's all about, no one's ever going to be creating a situation where they're trying to create a dark room or whatever, because there's that, the dark is a thing that happens when you go into a cave, right?
Right. Especially with this kind of cycle, right? Where somehow people know in the deep past there was darkness and it was a disaster, right? So it builds up to this primal thing.
Yeah.
And
of
we'll
course, come back to the story. I want to get into the actual issue of the magazine, like we always do.
Go for it.
Series.
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
And so let me do that now. I'll share screen with y'all. And here is the issue. It has some pretty funny ads. Okay, so this is the cover with the telescope and the, and it was a big deal that Asimov made the cover story, right? This was his first time being like headliner, and
and look, I think it's Hubert Rogers, I think, is the artist.
I don't
beautiful
know
cover
off the top of my head, but it's a huge deal that not only was he the cover, but there's some other big names in this issue, and they're not on the cover. It's entirely like Campbell's, I think Campbell really knew what he had, right?
So, that's actually a really good point, because I think back to like when Slan was originally serialized, right? It's on the cover there, but there's a bunch of other authors that are at least mentioned. And on this here, we just have Nightfall.
Right. And then, this ad for Listerine, cut them loose and let them go. That's pretty funny.
But whenever we talk about this stuff, I feel obliged to point out that the ads were sold for the Street and Smith magazines as a whole, right? So every magazine had the same ads. So Campbell was not in charge of the ads, and he hated them. It took like a long time before he could start to like get ads just for Astounding that would be pitched towards his readership.
It is a great point, and when you are not here, I make that same point for you, Alec.
Good.
One thing to note on this too that you made me think when we were thinking of the war anxieties, we were just recently talking on Dickheads about the boarding school that Phil went to in Ojai in the early 40s. In 1942, he was sent off to boarding school. And the ad for the boarding school pointed out that the boarding school was away from industrial sites. And the reason why in 1942 they pointed out that the boarding school was away from industrial sites is to say, hey, your kid won't get bombed here.
Wow.
Which is fascinating. Okay, so September 1941. So this is pre-World War II.
Wow.
And there's two really big heavy hitters in here, besides the fact that we also have a John W. Campbell story as well. I can only say that I have read Methuselah's Children and the Alfred Bester story, Adam and No Eve, are the only ones that I have read in here. I just, happened to read that Alfred Bester story recently because I read a collection of Alfred Bester stories and it was in there, and it's a pretty good one, but it's not great. But, Alfred Bester, I don't know how big time, I'm getting spam, guys. Let me see if I can, there we go. So Alfred Bester is, for me, he's a big deal because My Stars Stars My Destination, I think, is one of the best science fiction novels ever written. I am a fan of The Demolished Man, not as much as the other one. And I do like Alfred Bester's short stories quite a bit. So him being in this issue is a big deal for me. I'm not Methuselah's Children is not my favorite Robert Heinlein story. This is the one about the guy trying to extend his life for a real long time. I read that one so long ago, I don't really remember it, but we also have DeCamp in here. Anybody else that you want to make comment on as far as the table of contents here, Alec?
Yeah, I will say Caleb Saunders, perhaps the greatest science fiction writer of all time. Robert Heinlein, that is a Heinlein pen name.
Oh, okay.
I think Campbell had a policy about, he didn't want more than one story by the same author in each issue. And I don't know whether, I can't remember offhand, like if that's the reason why this is published under a different name. But yeah, so this is Elsewhere, aka Elsewhen in some anthologies by Robert Heinlein. It's a pretty good story.
So there were 2 Heinlein stories in this one. Gotcha. That's why we have the expert on.
Yeah. I will say I haven't read all these stories. I'm a big Raymond F. Jones fan. And I don't think I've read this one, Test of the Gods. But Raymond F. Jones is the author of my favorite science fiction story, Noise Level. So if you ever have a chance, if you haven't read it, Noise Level by Raymond F. Jones is my, if I had to pick one story, that's the one that I like the most out of this whole period.
Well, you have me intrigued now. Noise Level
If
by
you ever
Raymond F.
if you ever do
Jones.
like an episode about Noise Level, please give me a call. I have a lot to say about that story.
I may just do it as a favor to you, since you've been so good with your with the time that you volunteered for my podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the excuse would be for you to do an episode around it, but yes.
Hey, I think Alec
delighted.
Nevala-Lee saying it's his favorite science fiction story is a pretty good reason to do it.
Good.
So yeah, let's pencil that in for some time in the future for sure.
Nice.
And so yeah, I think the DeCamp is the first of 2 parts, and the Heinlein is the third. I don't know We're Not All Human by Campbell, but
that one I don't think is a story. I think that's an essay of some kind. I don't know what that would be.
Oh, that's
I don't recall offhand. Yeah.
Okay, and so the DeCamp is an article too. It looks like.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and a 2-part article. Interesting. Mission, I don't know. Short Circuited Probability, Norman L. Knight, no idea who that is, personally. And it says cover by Rogers.
Okay, good. That's what I thought. Hubert Rogers. Okay. I know this only because Asimov later goes to meet Rogers at the office after Rogers has painted the cover for Nightfall, and that's where he meets Hubbard for the first time at that meeting.
Okay, and here's how Nightfall appeared. New world, a people who saw stars, but once 2,000 years. React. Yeah. So this is how it begins. Let's see if there's other there. I'm sure there's other art we can kind of float around. See if there's, yeah, there's that. Yeah. Before we get into it, see if there's any other. Yeah, pretty basic art for the piece. So, yeah, I think I didn't really. Sometimes I try to look at issues a couple down the line to see what the reader reaction was. I didn't really feel the need to do that with this one because we know that this one became an instant classic. So I didn't feel quite the need to do that. Before we get into the science, let's get into the actual story, and I will stop share. Yeah, so how many times have we all read this, starting with Alec?
I would say probably 3 or 4 times. I read it this morning, so that was probably my 4th time, I'm going to say.
Yeah, same for me. I've listened to the Escape Pod episode a couple of times just to refresh on it for podcasts in the past. But I've read it in print a couple of times. I have the Nightfall and Other Stories ebook.
Yeah, so I originally read this story, I'm gonna say when I was in uh I started reading Asimov fairly young. So I was in fifth or sixth grade when I started with the Lucky Star juveniles, right? And then but Nightfall was one of the first um kind of adult sci-fi things by Asimov that I read because I had heard about it even when I was like in fifth or sixth grade. And I know this because I remember, I have a distinct memory of trying to explain to my mother what the story was about as a sixth grader. So um, I read it that far ago. I also read the Silverberg novel when it came out. And when I was in eighth grade, I actually went to see the movie uh, Nightfall, the very bad movie.
The 80s one, yeah.
Yeah, I saw it in the theater. I'm one of the few people that saw it in the theater. So, and an interesting story about that is that we had a grand old movie palace in my hometown in Bloomington, Indiana, called the Indiana Theater. I saw many, many movies there, including Raiders of the Lost Ark on opening day. But they had a balcony, and for a couple of years in the late 80s, they closed off the balcony and put a small screen up to have a second theater there. And that's where I saw Nightfall. And Nightfall was the first movie that they showed in the small balcony theater. So it's legendary in Bloomington as the first movie that showed there. And I think I was one of four people who went. And it was bad. So that's my history with that. Now, onto the actual story. Yeah, the cycle and the darkness thing were the two things that hit me most this time. What I will say is that I did have in my memory a little bit of like remembering things and being like, oh, this isn't there, and then knowing that in my head that they came from the Silverberg novel, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the things that hit me this time in reading the short story, so we should go through it. So the story, the hook of the journalist writing the story about the astronomers, let's talk about that because I think that's a great hook. I don't know if that was Campbell's idea or Asimov's idea, but the idea that this journalist is kind of breaking the story really gives a chance for the story to be questioning the astronomers, and it's a great setup for world building. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, because I think the journalist thing is one of the smartest things about the story.
And I will say, I love these old science fiction stories that just assume that newspapers will always be a thing, and journalists will be very important people. Not that they're not important. Obviously, journalism is important, but in this case, it's not really talking about the future because it's not Earth, although Earth is mentioned, and that's strange.
I'm going to get to that because
maybe you have something to say about that too. But that is strange.
Yeah, that was a bad choice, Asimov. But we'll get to that.
Well, wait. Yeah. Well, I mean, let's put a pin in that. Let's not forget to go back to that because I have a story about that.
Okay.
But I want to say, I agree that the journalist idea is like very clever. You want an outsider to kind of like be able to ask questions and kind of fill you in a little bit. Because, I mean, the story is interesting because it's all people just talking in two rooms, as far as I can tell, right? There's no change of scene. It's all kind of in real time, which is actually a nice touch, I think. But, for a story that is, so constrained and talky, it reads really well. It reads really well. And I think a big part of it is because of the journalist character. I think, he could kind of like draw out the characters and get the backstory in a way that seems fairly natural, that kind of makes the structure of the story work. Because again, it's like, it's a great premise. It's such a good premise for a story for reasons I'll talk about later. But, Asimov is not a world builder at this point. I mean, these guys, you can picture them as just a bunch of like, early 40s guys smoking cigars, like a lot of the early Foundation stories. There's no attempt to like differentiate this from Earth, and at least in the way the characters talk and interact, and which is very typical, right? Like, Asimov is not a world builder at this stage, at least in his career.
Yeah, and it's a good piece of world building to have the journalist and the psychologist kind of be the outside figures. And
Well,
it's
you have
funny because
everyone
I'm
come to
used to
him
how
too, right?
Philip K. Dick does world building is always based on your Mr. Taxpayer character. It's always told through somebody who owes money to somebody or
Mm-hmm.
is down on their luck. And so it's interesting for me as a Dickian to kind of see it done another way. And I do think the way he world builds in this is pretty fantastic because and it is next level world building for somebody who wasn't very adept at it yet. And I don't personally think Asimov is the best world builder.
No, I would agree. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but no, he was never, whatever you read him for, it's not that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's definitely ideas, I think, and
Yeah,
some are better than others. I think the robot mystery, the Caves of Steel, Naked Sun, Robots of Dawn. I think it's funny because I think Caves of Steel is one of the better world building
that's true.
novels that he did. And then whereas it's funny because I think Robots of Dawn kind of takes steps backwards, but it's getting really deep in something that we're not talking about today.
Yeah.
But
I think one of the smartest things here is to limit the amount of world building that needs to be done by having the ticking clock so
Mhm.
close to running out,
I
right?
agree.
It starts off just hours from the event.
Yeah, it's
yeah,
brilliant. I mean, the way that it's structured, because number one, you're told early on how much time they have, right? And then a little bit later, you have the physical eclipse taking place,
Yeah.
slowly creeping across, the last star, the last sun in the sky. And you're reading it again now, I'm like, this is really smart plot construction, and again, most of this I'm guessing is Asimov. I mean, I think Campbell gave him the premise and like some of the sort of basic ideas, but he really made it work in a way that I think really holds up.
and it made me wonder, as somebody who just went through their second solar eclipse, if Asimov had seen one, because he does such a great job of describing the temperature dropping,
Hmm.
and that's
That would
one
be a fun thing
aspect
to
of
look
the
into.
solar eclipse that's
Yeah,
really
I don't
cool.
know. I don't know offhand, but that's a good question.
Yeah, because because I know it's about 95% of totality when you really feel it, and you're just like, woo, hey.
Hmm.
Hey, the temperature just dropped. And it's a really significant part of the story is when the character is talking about how cold their toes feel, right? Which is a good detail.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's all good stuff. But I think the construction of this, and that's one of the things is that I think that you know for whatever you read, like what you said, Alec, whatever you read Asimov for, this story is, I think, in basketball, we talk about it when somebody's in the zone when they're shooting, right?
Hmm.
And like Asimov was in the zone on this one, like big time,
Yeah.
like better than he was most of the time, even years later. And honestly, and it's funny because I think that I mean, we know that towards the end of his life, there was a period where he didn't even really want to write fiction anymore, right? And he had to be kind of cajoled into writing fiction again. And he was young and hungry and wanting to prove himself at this point, and I think it shows.
Yeah. It's also important to note that, Asimov later says that, Campbell gave him this idea, but he wasn't sure whether Campbell had this idea in mind for him or whether he just happened to be the one writer who came into the office that day. Could have been somebody else, right? Which to me
Right.
is really interesting because number one, who knows what another writer from that period would have done with this idea, but it also like really proved Asimov not just to readers but to Campbell. I mean, at that point, Campbell, his respect for Asimov that he delivered so well this premise, I think, shut up enormously. I think it enabled a lot of the collaboration that we see in the years to come. So if Asimov had not chosen to go to the office on that particular day, I think the whole history of science fiction, I'm not exaggerating, would have been very different.
Oh no, I absolutely agree. Like that alternate universe where Asimov decided to stay and study at the candy shop
I mean,
instead.
honestly, it could have been Hubbard. Hubbard could have been in the office that day, Hubbard wrote many stories to order for Campbell, and that is a very interesting alternate history. Like, what would the L. Ron Hubbard version of the story look like?
Yeah. And on top of that, like, would Asimov have been given the green light to do Foundation if he hadn't proven himself with Nightfall? And would we have Foundation? Alec, I think you are completely correct when you say the whole history of science fiction could be completely different. These fuse points happen with writers all the time. I mean, with Philip K. Dick, if Tony Boucher hadn't come in looking for opera records in the record store he worked at, we might not have Philip K. Dick. We might not have Blade Runner, because Philip K. Dick had given up on, he wasn't even really reading science fiction. He wasn't writing science fiction because he thought it was kid stuff. Yeah. And Tony Boucher coming in and buying records and being this guy that he respected and being a professional science fiction writer is why he took it seriously. And without those two things, would we have that? And I think this inflection point where Asimov gets the go-ahead to write Nightfall, it is truly a hinge point in the history of science fiction, for sure. For sure. Which is, can sound like a grand statement, but I'm with you. I agree wholeheartedly.
It's funny because, not to take this too far, but not so much this story, but Foundation, it's about prediction. It's about being able to forecast what's going to happen, and stuff like this. It's so contingent. It's so based on chance. You could never predict that Asimov would happen to be the office that day as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And
forecasting what science fiction would look like if so much of it is based on these chance encounters.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And we have to remember that the especially as less connected as the genre was back then, how much of those relationships played a role in all that. It's crazy. So we have the journalist, we have the whole story where they get into the history and the cycle, where they're talking about the fact that every 2,000 years this happened. This is definitely shades of Foundation. This is an aspect that didn't really hit home with me before reading it this time. And I do think that this idea that that history, that this civilization is only 2,000 years old because, they all, went mad the last time this happened is a fairly interesting concept. And then you think right there, that had my brain going, thinking about how the civilization worked, how they're, and I think this is one of the things you do read Asimov for, is the things that it makes your brain do, kind of on the sidelines, even if not all of it works. Yeah, you're thinking about it. Seth, how did you feel about this whole was this cycle, has this always been a part of the story for you, or was this a recent discovery?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's the two parts of the cycle, right? Where you have the kind of cultists, right, who are like, hey, there's a cycle here, like the Doomsday Prophets that crop up, Harold Camping of 10 years ago, saying the world's going to end, that kind of thing. But in this case, you have the kind of convergence of, the religious fanatics are saying the world's going to end, and the scientists now have science to show, oh, this could be an explanation for what they're talking about. And so you have that kind of almost uneasy truce between them, where the religious or the cultists don't want to admit that, right? They're like, well, you've made it less special, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that kind of struck me reading it today is that, the idea of whether there are cycles in history is very, it's highly debated, or at least used to be, and there are a lot of writers who have found patterns in history. And the nice thing about Nightfall is that it is literally a cycle linked to an astronomical event, right? It is a objective event that triggers this cataclysm, and you can predict when it's going to happen. It's almost like an idealized picture of what psychohistory would look like, where you have an objective predictable event that is linked to these changes, right? In real life, and even in like some of the stories that end up coming out of this theme, it's not as obvious, and you have to kind of be Harry Seldon, to sort of see that this cycle is about to end. Whereas in this case, an astronomer who has the data can kind of predict, when down to the minute exactly when it's going to happen again.
Right, and I think the other thing too is Asimov is showing that his interest in science and like wanting to do a science story, and not all the this is not a pulp, nothing. There's nothing wrong with Vampires on Venus stories by C.L. Moore. I love those stuff too. I Shambleau is one of my favorite stories of all time. But this is like an attempt to be hard sci-fi with a fantastical edge. And I think one of the things too is that you could have I do like that the names are just Jerry 45, he's showing that that in this society they just do it that way, right? But he doesn't go deep into it. He doesn't give you an explanation for why. You just have to figure that out. And I know that in Silverberg and Asimov's introduction to the novel, they talk more about how, well, we could have called the Miles Blee Boops or whatever, but instead, just consider this a translation, and I think the fact that the world building just is what it is. I think the fact that it's all in 2 rooms also prevents you from having to have sky cars or, the aerial tram or whatever, because you're not seeing a lot of the rest of the world. And that's something that, I think adds to the story, because we don't really have to know that much more. We can just have it contained to these people who are having this personal reaction to it.
It's funny because if you were a certain kind of world builder, this would be a fun premise to start with, because one thing that I noticed in this reread is that they talk about how they just discovered the law of universal gravitation kind of recently. It seems like it's a new thing. And they actually have this funny section where they think about, oh, well, so what would a world with just one sun look like? And they would say, well, it couldn't support life because night and day would be too extreme. But also it's maybe they would have figured out gravity a lot sooner if they only had one sun. But I like the idea of what would a kind of a futuristic society look like, that unfolded on that timetable, and a certain kind of writer would have a lot of fun playing with what would the cars look like, what would transportation look like, what would science look like, and he doesn't really do that. And I don't think it's clearly this story works better in a lot of ways because it's just and I actually haven't read the novel. I don't know if the novel does more with that sort of thing than the story does.
Yes, the novel does a lot more world building, but not as much as you might think. I mean, granted, I read it when it came out in 1991, so my memory of it might be not the best. But
one of my favorite things actually about this is the way it gets me thinking about the stellar mechanics, and then you get further down into the story and they start speculating about things like the single star system and how that wouldn't be stable, and it's like he's making fun of the nerds who are going to analyze his story, which I thought was great.
Yeah, and that was definitely a laugh out loud moment for me reading it this time.
There may be 24 stars.
Well, here this is actually something I want to talk about, which I think is again a genius thing that just kind of comes almost inadvertently out of the premise, which is this kind of dramatic irony, because we know what stars are like. We know what night is like. We know all these things that the characters don't know. And so it adds this extra level of suspense to the story, because they're what's going to happen when they find out, and it's really great. I mean, and again, I don't think it's something you can really plan. It just sort of comes out of the idea, but it just adds so much to the story that you, the reader, know more than the characters do at almost every point, and you're just waiting to see how they react to it.
Well, and
so the first part of the novel is about an experiment where all these people go insane riding this amusement park ride that takes you through darkness, which is a really interesting, it's very Silverberg way to kind of express this. But it's interesting because and it's funny because when I read it at the time, because Asimov was more known to me, I assumed that Silverberg did less work and Asimov did most of it, right? And whereas the opposite, where like Silverberg wrote the two parts before and after. And the way the novel works is that basically the first part is like a prequel and the second part is almost like a sequel. And one thing that I didn't like thinking when I was thinking about the novel after rereading the story is the novel kind of sets up the idea that they really do go mad, right? And they really do go crazy. And I kind of, the way I would like to see the story work out is that this is the first time they're able to get past it because science helped them get through it. But
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's not the impression you get from the ending, right? Like,
Right.
reading the ending again, I was just like really struck by how dark it is. Like, literally, it is like
Yeah.
it is like an incredibly bleak ending, and it's almost Lovecraftian in a way, where like you see like this rational character, his mind is just obliterated, by the sight of the stars, and you get this kind of like, kind of like almost like a gibberish. It's almost like
Right.
Stephen King does sometimes, where you have a character, whose like mind is broken, and you kind of like hear them, like sort of see that disintegration happening on the page, and to see that in like an Asimov story is very interesting because it's not some place that he normally goes, and I think it's really effective.
Yeah, but it's very Campbellian too. Like,
Mhm.
if you're writing to please Campbell, like that idea works really well for Campbell, I'm sure. So
Well, I remember, I mean, my favorite part of the origin story for this is, how when Campbell says, "What do you think would happen if the men saw the stars for the first time?" Asimov says, "I don't know." That is his response. He doesn't have an idea, whereas Campbell has a
I
very
think they'd
clear
go
idea.
crazy, right?
Yeah,
So then Asimov's like, okay, well, I'm writing to that end, right?
right,
Because he's
right.
writing.
Which I mean, it's not the kind of thing that he would normally do. I'm guessing that if he were
Yeah.
given this assignment, who knows where he would have ended up, right? But he's not the kind of person who normally ends the story with everyone going mad and like the city burning in the distance.
Well, it's funny because I had this thought experiment with myself today, which is, basically I was thinking about this, but that was a really stupid way of explaining myself. Uh, but I actually thought I had this thought in my mind today about Nightfall as a Twilight Zone episode from the 60s. And I was kind of picturing in my head like Serling doing the introduction, and the way that I kept seeing it was like the ticking clock as being like a monster outside the window, basically, is like this thing that's coming. And I actually thought that Nightfall could make a really great sci-fi horror movie if you paced it and did it correctly. You could do a faithful adaptation that focuses on the fear and the tension and like kind of people losing their minds all in this closed space.
Yeah,
Happening.
I was
And
thinking
I
of
haven't
it.
seen the 2000 movie. I don't know if that's what they did. I don't know.
No, it is not.
Okay.
I was thinking of it more as like a single room play, right? Because I think the worst thing you can do in an adaptation of this is show the stars, because to us that's mundane, right?
Mhm.
That's the everyday
Yeah.
thing that we are not seeing the same thing that they're seeing when that comes out, right? If that's going to drive them mad, there's no analog to that for us. We need to see them.
Yeah. Now I want to
Yeah.
write a play.
That's a good idea.
Nightfall.
I actually like that idea a lot.
Seth, you and I should write a play of Nightfall. How about that?
All right, sounds good. We'll do it like Campbell and Asimov. So there, that you have my idea. You go now.
Okay. So I don't know. You got to tell me how it is.
Exactly. Great.
Right. Well, we'll get into the science here soon, but I really do think that there's also multiple interpretations for how you could see this, how you could focus on how this story plays out, right? Because like you can see this story based on the whole fear aspect. You could focus on the science aspect. You could focus on like the fact that this is a very character driven story, even though it doesn't seem like it, right? And this all comes down to the fact that I think this story, Nightfall, there's a lot of Asimov novels and short stories and fiction that I think well, they function as good science fiction and they function as good Asimov. This is one that I think you could teach in a literature class and you could get away with, I mean, you'd get a little bit of snooty reaction. However, I think this is high literature science fiction. I don't know if you guys agree with me, but I think it is.
In terms of like being a teachable story, in terms of like, look at this, how it's constructed, how it builds suspense, I think absolutely. I think it would be a fantastic story in a way that, not a lot of Asimov stories would be. I mean, it's not from this period,
Yeah.
I mean, I was saying, like this is probably the third or fourth time I've read it again. There are a lot of Asimov stories from this period that I've read once, and that's basically enough. Like I know the premise, I know the twist or whatever at the end. They're not stories that work on a storytelling level to the point where, and even like Nightfall, sometimes I kind of forget. I kind of read the first page and the writing is like, okay, I'm like, okay, I'll just read this now. But you get sucked in. It really works as a story for all the reasons we've been talking about. So yeah, I think it would be a really fun story to teach in like a writing class.
Yeah, I agree. And there's lots of threads to pull on, right? You could look at like you could assign people what's another analog to the darkness that's presented here, right? You could easily tie that back into like all the mythology that deals with the sea as this symbol of chaos, right? It's all throughout.
It would be
Western civilization.
Now that we're talking, I mean, every so often I will teach a writing class, but I'm like a writing class based just on Nightfall, like going on almost like line by line, like seeing how the story, with its limitations, I think that's actually very important. The writing is like okay. There's certain parts where you're like, okay, Asimov is still a very young guy. He is not a world builder necessarily. He is not a great prose stylist. Despite all that, like the spine of the story is so strong that it works despite Asimov's flaws at this stage, at least as a writer.
Yeah, I've threatened the idea of doing a writing class based entirely on the first chapter of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, as far as like how to start a novel. And it's the same thing as like, I don't think Phil is the greatest stylist of all time. I don't think that's why he is what he is, but like that first chapter is a master class in world building and doing all these things. And what is really interesting about Nightfall is that he clicks all these boxes to make it a classic story and a classic science fiction story and to all of these things. There's just one thing that makes me want to pull my hair out, and that's the reference to Earth. Do we want to talk about that now and then get into the science of it, or do we want to do the science first? What do you guys think?
I would talk about it. I have a whole thing about it. I don't know if anyone else wants to go first.
Well, let me read it. Let me read it out loud because it's terrible. Through it shone the stars, not Earth's feeble 3,600 stars visible to the eye. Langash was in the center of a giant cluster. 30,000 mighty suns shone down in soul-searing splendor that was more frighteningly cold in its awful indifference than bitter wind that shivered across the cold, bleak world. There's great stuff here, but like saying this isn't like Earth's crappy stars totally breaks the everything in the wall. It's the one thing I don't like about this story. I hated this. Are you going to defend it, Alec, or what?
Real quick here. I had remembered that was from character viewpoint, not an omniscient, authorial viewpoint. So like in my memory, it was worse, right? But since it's from the author perspective, I'm more or less okay with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you ready?
Yes.
So I won't defend it. And neither would Asimov, because he did not write that sentence. Campbell wrote that sentence. Asimov didn't see that sentence until I believe the story was published. Like he got the issue of the magazine and saw that Campbell had inserted a sentence. And I think, I mean, I don't have the exact, I mean, it's in his memoirs here somewhere, but he really felt like, yeah, what you're saying, like it just takes the reader out of the story. It's a big mistake. At that point, you're still caught up into it. You don't really care that much. But yeah, no, he said the exact same thing. And this is a Campbell editorial insertion that I think pissed Asimov off at the time too.
As we say on the Dickheads podcast, editorial fuckery.
Yeah.
Don Wollheim, to this day, I think Don Wollheim's editorial fuckery on Eye in the Sky ruined a masterpiece. But, it happens. And man, now that I know it's Campbell's fault, that makes me even more mad. Makes me mad for Asimov. Like,
Yeah,
I
maybe
mean,
when you're
that's
doing
just
your when we cover the astronomy, I'll look up the sentence in the memoir because it is very interesting to see Asimov's reaction to it.
all right. Well, let's do that on this note. Well, I mean, do you have anything else to say, Seth, about the Earth line?
No, not really. It was jarring the first time I read that.
Okay. So, let's see. I gotta.
My favorite part when anybody screen shares is so you can see what they've recently been doing if they haven't closed their tabs.
Well, this is all tabs for this, but you
Yeah,
can see my bookmarks. So you can see that I have the Encyclopedia Dicania right there
nice.
and links to my book, which is not that exciting. All right. So here is the Asimov approved.
Oh, this is cool.
I love this.
Yes. This is the Asimov approved star system. So you have the main sun-like Onus, which is 1 AU orbit, about similar to Earth, as so Kalagash, is that how you say it? And then it has the faint Dovium, which they orbit together. So that would be like tidally locked, basically, that it's mostly in this one position, but it would be a little bit slower. And that's why, every once in a while, it's normally in the sky, but it's a red dwarf, so it's much dimmer. And that's why we mentioned that at certain times that the red dwarf being in the sky makes like a red tinge.
Was
And
there
then,
a name change of the planet in the novel from Lagash to Kalgash?
yes, I
Okay.
think, yeah, Lagash in the short story, and then in the novel, it's
Okay.
Kalagash. Yeah. Either that or that's the name of this. Yes, that's why. Yeah. And then a binary pair. That's two binary stars. So they are orbiting each other, right? They're spinning with each other, and then they orbit each other, which means that their gravitational pull goes on each other. And then they would have an orbit that would go all the way around the main star. So they would have, so the 2,000-year cycle would take that stars, the two binary stars around. Okay. So in a wide orbit. So that's how the orbital mechanics would work for that. So that's why, you wouldn't always see those stars, because depending upon where Dovium is, and if you're on the other side of Onus, you wouldn't see the binary stars. And so it would have to be a perfect timed out situation of where, you're over here and they're in the right position, and then voila. And but Sean Raymond, who I tried desperately to get onto this podcast, you guys know because you watched me trade emails with him,
Mhm.
but he lives in France and he has an absolutely different schedule. And he's very busy. He's the one who made this. Okay. And this was on his website, planetplanet.net. So you can go and look at, he breaks down the science and all this in much more detail, because probably if he's listening to this, he's screaming and pulling his hair out because I'm not getting it right. I'm getting it as close to as I can. Now, this is the system that he believes could work, right?
Wow.
And it would require a central black hole of a few thousand solar masses, and Kagalash would be orbiting its main star, and the main star would orbit the black hole, right, in the center. And then there would be a ring of 8 evenly spaced like stars. And then, so I don't know how, when what he's saying is that they would have to, at the right time, be in a situation. I don't this one doesn't make as much sense to me, but this is where he's saying that basically the only way he could see it working to have enough stars that are in a similar area that they would be close enough to affect one planet is if they had one anchoring massive black hole in the middle. And but what's interesting about that is where it would change the world building is their knowledge of gravitation would have to identify the black hole, but would they know what a black hole is? And then, would they be able to identify it is the question. So, Sean gets into this a lot more in these articles, but there's also other astronomers that have tried to tackle the Nightfall science. I just personally think Sean's was the best take on it.
That's a very cool website, I have to say. I'm going to have to reach out to Sean to get him on my podcast.
Yeah, good luck.
I've dealt with Europe plenty of times.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. And so what he does is sometimes too, what he'll do for people is he likes just exploring solar systems. So like he'll do like Dune, and he'll like say, oh, here's what we know from the science of all of this, and then we'll try to figure out how the solar system works. And he's done Tatooine and all those types of things, and so it's great and interesting stuff. But so what we do know is that the sun, one thing that's interesting too is that the main sun is a 10-minute light travel away. So and one of the things that I thought was interesting about some of these articles is he talked about the light distance, and so you could calculate down to the minute like how many, like how long the totality in the last sunset would last. And that's when I get into like, wow, you nerds are awesome. And I generally just think that's cool. So that's what we know basically. That's a layman's look at the science. We did talk when I had Sean on the podcast, we did talk about Nightfall a little bit there. So you can go and listen to that. But we just actually started like making up in that interview. We just started making up solar systems, and it was very fun. So I highly recommend that chat. And yes, you should have Sean on your podcast. I highly recommend that. And one of the things too is that when you can get astronomers to think speculatively, it's great. And not all of them want to. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, Avi Loeb is my favorite astronomer, but a lot of us, he's not an astronomer's astronomer, if you get my, because he's like willing to take wild ideas and fly with them. And
years ago, I read a book called How the Hippies Saved Physics, because physics had kind of gotten to a stale point.
Yeah. And and I would highly recommend too. I had Avi on the podcast, but he caught a lot of shit for being the guy to say that Oumuamua was probably extraterrestrial origin. And first of all, he only said probably, and we should look into it, but it turned into people hating him because they said he said it, as if, you know what I mean? And that's just how it goes sometimes. But back to Nightfall. Nightfall has been adapted a couple times, of course, because it's a classic. One of my favorite is the X-1 radio drama. I think it's great. And X-1, if people don't know, is the first and the only form of other media that Philip K. Dick ever wrote for. So he wrote an episode of X-1. We have talked about that show before on this series in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, because The Roads Must Roll was also on X-1.
Yeah, so. and I'll insert that Campbell was a consultant for the show, and I think he helped us them to select stories to adapt for the radio.
Exactly. And then as far as the 1988 movie goes, it's a very weird movie. It's not good. I don't recommend that you watch it. And I am scarred from having seen it in my childhood, because I was so excited to see an Isaac Asimov movie, and it was terrible. And then the 2000 movie I have avoided, but I will say I think the best version of this concept made into film or anything else is Pitch Black.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. When they turned it into an action movie, actually really pretty much worked.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I love in particular in Pitch Black when you see that, they don't have any other kinds of fuel, right? Because they have so much sunlight. They don't need any other energy, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's something here where in this story, it's one of those things where I'm like, they make references to electricity and to other things. And I guess you could have solar power. But I guess you wouldn't have had to make the experiments to create electric light, but a lot of developments in technology happen by accident, right? Somebody accidentally makes a big arc and you end up with arc lighting, right? That was like the first kind of, it wasn't a light bulb, but it was the first kind of electric lighting. Somebody would probably know about that, but it's again, you're not supposed to think about it.
Why would you need to have people ever invent lights when you live in a planet with 6 suns? And there's
well, it's funny because
light.
At one point, they show off this like great new invention. And it's like, is it a candle or a torch?
Right.
This like innovative thing they've invented like just recently.
Yeah, and because there's definitely not a lot of cavers on Lagash, because they're definitely like, hell no.
Right. And that's kind of the hope of this story, right? That even though everybody goes mad at the end, that maybe there's some of the science that's been preserved. And in the next cycle, they'll be more prepared, right? They obviously need to start exposing people to darkness prior to the stars coming out.
The story implies that, like only children and idiots are left over after this happens. So we'll see how well they do.
Right. You end up with idiocracy, right?
Yeah. Well, and I will say that Pitch Black, that elevator pitch when David Twohy went in and said it's Aliens meets Asimov's Nightfall, that is an awesome elevator pitch.
Wow.
Yeah.
And it makes me want to go watch that movie again. I haven't seen it in a couple years, and I probably do. Although Star Trek Prodigy season 2 came out, so that's going to have all my attention tonight. On that note, we'll be covering that season of Star Trek Prodigy on the show next week. So, but that's neither here nor there. So, all right. So Nightfall, any closing thoughts? I think we've covered it pretty good. Is there anything we missed? Because I know this is a doozy. This might be the signature story of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, really, in a lot of ways. We've got a long way to go, but this might be one of the most important stories.
Yeah, I agree. I feel lucky to have been here to talk about it. And while you were talking, I did find the
give it to us
section. So this is, if people haven't read this, this is In Memory Yet Green, the first volume of Asimov's first autobiography.
I love how wonderfully worn that book is.
You should see the other. So just not to get too off track here, but this is the other one. Like I've read this book in pieces, in part because it's not super well made, maybe, but no, an essential book if you're a fan of science fiction or Asimov. I love it. It's my favorite books, of science fiction history.
I take such good care of my PKD reference books. I try very hard.
Yeah, I mean, every page of this is underlined multiple times. I've gone through it so many times, so I was able to find the section without too much trouble. So this is about Asimov reading the print version of Nightfall for the first time. How it kind of made him into like a major writer. And he says, "Yet in one respect, I must admit, I was dissatisfied with Nightfall. Campbell, finding my ending lacking, had inserted a paragraph of his own very near the end that was very effective, but simply wasn't me. It has been praised as proof that I could write poetically, which gravels me, since I don't want to write poetically. I only want to write clearly. Worst of all, Campbell thoughtlessly mentioned Earth in his paragraph. I had carefully refrained from doing so all through the story, since Earth did not exist within the context of the story. Its mention was a serious literary flaw." So that's Asimov's take on that.
Well, and you know what? If you look at now when I read the paragraph out loud, it is a Campbell paragraph. It is not an Asimov paragraph.
Yeah. I mean, if you know, once you know, it stands out, right? Even more than it does on first reading.
Ooh, editorial fuckery. Oh my goodness. That is painful. Yeah, it's oh man, that really hurts. Okay, well, I'm glad you read that part to us because I think that is very important information. And it is interesting to know. Well, I think, for examples, like I know Stephen King has a hard time with people like still thinking The Stand is his best work, to this day, like, because it was so early that sometimes he's like, okay, you like The Stand. But at the same time, I know writers a lot of times eventually will come back to these things like, King obviously just agreed to do a whole anthology of stories set in The Stand, right, with new writers. And I think Asimov letting Silverberg, come back to Nightfall was kind of it's interesting that he didn't want to do it, right? And I know Silverberg expanded three of his short stories, also The Ugly Little Boy and Positronic Man. So he did three of those, but it's interesting. And I know Nightfall was the one I think that he was the happiest with, because I know he praised it as like there was nothing that he could have complained about.
Okay.
So he did like it. So,
well, I mean, I will say quickly, I think this will be my last contribution. Asimov never thought Nightfall was his best story. In fact, I'm not sure it would even make his top 5, because I know for a fact that his top 3 favorite stories of his own were The Last Question, Ugly Little Boy, and Bicentennial Man. And I'm pretty sure The Mule, I'm guessing, would be pretty high up there in his own ranking, right, of his own stories. So yeah, he always said that, people tell him that Nightfall is the best science fiction story ever written, but he says, I don't think it's even the best science fiction story I ever wrote.
I think I might disagree with him. It might be his best.
I like some of the other ones better. I like Last Question and Bicentennial Man and The Mule, especially a lot.
Bicentennial Man is great.
Yeah, that is a good one.
Yeah. And I'd have to read The Last Question again, and I probably will.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
Yeah, that's another story. If you ever do an episode about it, I would love to hop in.
Well, we could do Alec's Choice and do.
Wow, that's very tempting. It's like the most random.
You come up with
bag.
a third one, and
right.
then we cover 3 stories.
Okay,
how about that? I'll do that interested. For you, Alec, because for a couple reasons. One, because you've given your time to me, and 2, Astounding is a book I've read twice now and very, very helpful. So
okay, great. Yeah, I think that needs to be 3. So I will think hard about what the third story would be.
Okay, do you have time? And maybe towards the end of the summer, we'll Seth, you want to come back for Alec's Choice?
I mean, every time I'm on here, Alec's on here, so
sure. Well, let's do it. No, seriously, let's do it.
Alec's Choice. Okay. Well, and I'm here for it. So we know 2, so you have to come up with a third.
Okay, interesting.
Yep.
All right.
And then we start scheduling it in, September and record it sometime in April.
Maybe.
Yeah,
we don't have to worry about astronomers.
Right. True.
We're on our own schedule.
Yeah.
Hey, none of this was our fault. This was entirely the astronomers.
There was one point where I was like, just go ahead and go without me because I was out,
going to, Seth, and I still couldn't get the astronomers with just the astronomer and Alec.
Okay.
So let me tell you, next time it won't be so bad. All right.
Yep.
I have a whining chihuahua at the door. We're a chihuahua retirement home now. So, all right, guys.
Thanks for hosting, David. This was fun.
Yeah. Next up is The Weapon Shop by A.E. Von Vogt. And I'm going to have some Philip K. Dick experts on because they need to know more about A.E. Von Vogt because he was the biggest influence on the guy. So Professor David Gill will be here, and Keith Giles, who is a noted Dick scholar as well. And so I don't know who the third guest is going to be. We're going to have somebody else, but someone from Dick circles will be on that episode because I'm trying to get the Dickians to take AE Von Vogt more seriously. And
Nice.
also on Dickheads soon, we'll be covering the Games Machine trilogy, as I call it, which is The World of Null A, Solar Lottery, and The Gamesman by Barry Maltzberg.
Nice.
And so, guys, tell folks how they can find your work and what you're working on.
I'll go first. So this is Alec Nevala-Lee speaking. The name is pretty distinctive. So look me up online, Google me. My blog is still there. You can contact me through the contact page. And I always like hearing from readers. My next project is going to be a biography of Louis W. Alvarez, who was a Manhattan Project physicist who won the Nobel Prize, is probably best known for coming up with the asteroid impact extinction theory of the dinosaurs. That's coming out next year from Norton. I just delivered the final draft to my publisher this week. So I'm hoping that you'll see it sometime in the summer of 2025.
Awesome.
That
And
sounds
then,
great.
yeah,
Seth,
go ahead.
What
Yeah.
what are you working on? And you're going to Scotland soon.
I am going to Worldcon this year, so I will be there. So if there's anybody watching this, listening to this, who wants to come say hello, just reach out to me. Usually you can find me online at Hugo's Podcast. That's my kind of podcasting handle, but you can also look me up, just first and last name, Seth Heasley. There is another Seth Heasley in Pennsylvania. I'm the one in Oregon. So
I'm voting for you.
All right. Thanks, David.
Yeah, Hugo nominated podcast. I mean, that's a pretty big deal there, Seth.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. I as your podcasting friend, I am stoked beyond belief for you. I think
Thanks,
that's
man.
great and well deserved. On that note, probably the next episode of this podcast will be covering Star Trek Prodigy Season 2 with my bridge crew, Issa Diao and Sarah Lynn Mishner, who cover most Star Trek with me. I'm not sure who our fourth guest will be. I'm trying to convince David Mack to come on because he was a consultant on the first season, but I don't think he wants to give his opinion on things that he was so close to. So he might not want to do it, but you know. Star Trek Prodigy, for folks who have not watched it at all, because a lot of people didn't watch it because it's a kid's cartoon, I think it's great Star Trek. And not just because Janeway's in it and she's from my hometown, but I do share a hometown with Janeway, and I do love Prodigy. And if you can get over the kiddie stuff, the kid nature of the stuff, it's great Star Trek, in my opinion. So it's animated, so what? I like it better than Lower Decks, personally. Which, you know, neither here nor there. All right. On that note, folks, we'll see you next time on this series for the Weapon Shop, and we'll be back on track on the schedule. So, anyways, thanks for joining us. You guys were awesome, as always, and look forward to Alex Dealer's Choice. It's going to be interesting. Well, I don't know what the third one's going to be, but
yeah. I mean, I have some ideas, but maybe people can just sort of wait and see.
Oh yeah, how about we keep that one secret, since we
That'll
gave
be
away
fun.
2 of them.
That'll be fun.
Nice.
Yes, we'll keep that secret. And folks will tune into that, I'm sure. All right, thank you for joining us, and see you next time.